Okay, so we can start with, let's say, the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Michal Berek. I'm a member of the Committee of the European Greens, and I am responsible for the municipal activities of the European Greens. I was selected to host this parallel session, which focuses on local responses to the consequences of the corona crisis, with focus on issues of public transportation, sustainable tourism, and air pollution, which is like the full name and introduction of the content of this session. I would like to introduce three guest speakers of this session. First is Magdalena Davis, who is the mayor of the Mníšek pod Brdy in the Czech Republic. She is a mayor since 2018, and her background is in biology and science, but now she serves as a mayor of this small town, and she's also a co-chair of the Czech Greens. So nice to see you, Magdalena.
Hello, Michal, and hello, everybody else.
Our second guest is Elke van den Brand. She's a minister for mobility, public works and road safety in Brussels capital region in Belgium for the Flemish Green Party Groen, and she's in this position since July 2019. So hello, Elke. And our third guest is Burkhard Horn, who is an expert on mobility and transport from Berlin, Germany. She's an urban planner, and he has 25 years of experience in different positions in city administration, working for the head of the transport in the Berlin City Senate. And since 2017, he's freelancing consultant on urban transport policy and planning. So hello, Burkhard.
Hi.
The outline of this session is that we have three very short presentations. I ask all our guests to put up a very short presentation, which should serve as a starting point of the conversation. I ask about, like, let's say, the most important issues of dealing with the corona crisis in the area of mobility, transport, or tourism. And so I think 5 or 6 slides are quite enough for all of us. They are good enough to focus on the most important stuff, and they are, let's say, good starting point for the debate afterwards. So we will have these 3 short presentations, and then we will have a debate. I have prepared a few questions, but I would like to give floor to our participants to ask your questions. Definitely there will be a lot of ideas popping in your mind during this presentation, during the sessions. We decided to use the chat, which has the function for the questions. So if you will have a question, don't hesitate to use the chat, and we will try to answer those questions. Please indicate to who are you directing the question, or indicate if it's a question for all our guests, so we know who is supposed to answer the question. Okay, let's start with the presentations. We have prepared the first one from Burkhard, so I would like to give the floor to you, and it's your time now.
Yes, thanks, Michal. Once again, hi to everyone, and thanks for this invitation to have the possibility to share some thoughts with you on this very, very important topic right now in all of our cities. Of course, it's a view from Berlin, and Berlin isn't typical for all of Europe, as Germany also isn't typical for all of Europe, what's the situations in the COVID crisis has been. But still, I think there are some general thoughts we can share from that. I can skip that one because Michal already introduced me, and I want to start with a list of the challenges as I see them from my personal view, that first we are facing right now during the crisis, and we don't know if there might be another one some years from now. We again have to change things very quickly, and also what will happen after that, and what are the actually maybe even the bigger challenges. Today, during the crisis, of course, we have to create safe and healthy conditions for everyone who still should move through our cities, and even more important, still make mobility possible for everyone, regardless his social status, if he has a car or not, to get to the places he has to go if he wants to go to work and other things. And of course, the crisis has given us unforeseen opportunity to test things, to break out of our own patterns in very different ways, the way we live, the way we act, but also how we use public space. And I think that is a very, very big chance for all of us. What will happen after it? We all have known and already discussed that in many cities we can observe that some people are returning to use their car more often than they have done before, because they feel safer there and because public transport especially doesn't feel safe. So that'll be a big challenge. The second is, can we make that permanent, what we are just trying in cities like Brussels, Berlin and others, to redistribute public space? Maybe the biggest challenge is public transport, because in most big cities it is the backbone of sustainable mobility, and if it breaks down and if it doesn't recover, we have a big problem concerning extended car use. And then there are of course things we have also learned or had to learn during the last months and weeks. Actually, we have learned that we can do things different than we have been used for decades. The way we work, the way we communicate, the way we go shopping. Lots of us, especially in the big cities, have kind of rediscovered our neighborhoods. We don't have to drive to the shopping center with a car for 6 or 8 kilometers to do our weekend shopping, but we have learned again that in our neighborhoods there are qualities, and these qualities have to be maintained. And what we still don't know yet, but I think every city will have to deal with it, will have restricted budgets. The COVID crisis costs us all a lot of money, and we don't know how the budgets of the cities will develop in the next 2 or 3 years, and what does that mean for transport planning. What has happened in Berlin? I think this so-called pop bike lanes have become quite popular throughout Europe, and because especially one district in Berlin decided to make things that have always been planned now as actually a temporary measure, because marking new bike lanes in the street, in the road space, partly also protected by these bollards you can see. And that has become very popular and also a very big discussion in Berlin. It's mostly taking part right now only in the inner city, but also some are planned in the more outside the inner city. There's discussion going on and if this can be a permanent solution. It's also discussion about safety and the effects of public transport and delivery. There have been some of these measures which weren't planned that carefully as they should have been. So, for example, in one street in the western part of the inner city, there are now buses blocked in only one lane left to get together with the private car traffic, and that actually probably can't be the goal of such a measure. And the second thing I would like to show you is to deal with minor streets, to create more space for pedestrians and also to make distancing easier. One on the right side is something that has happened also already in several districts, then that some minor roads in the neighborhoods are closed for car traffic, for all car traffic on Sunday afternoons, for children to play, to use the space just in the way the people living there want to do it. We have also closed some streets around market areas to create more space for these markets. And these are things where I think that to make this permanent will be more easier than some of the bike lanes in the streets, because everyone living there actually sees the benefits that it is for their daily lives, and that it's actually much more comfortable to use the public space in front of their houses where they live and to enjoy the benefits of this car-free spaces. Of course, there are also other things in Berlin going on, which I won't mention with specific slides. We have actually maintained public transport all through the crisis on quite a high level, because we thought it's crucial that public transport should still be available to get to every part of the city quite comfortable. Although, of course, also in Berlin, the use of the public transport has gone down to minus 90% in some areas. We have a free use of the public-funded bike sharing schemes. 33 minutes, first 30 minutes are free for everyone to use. And of course, we've also observed some other developments concerning car sharing and ride pooling. Most of the ride pooling services we had closed for the time, except of one, which is also public funded, which was still running, but also for the people that were working in the health sector, had to get to hospitals and so on all through the night, and they could use these ride pooling services. Just a view over the borders of Berlin, what's happening elsewhere. Actually, last week there was a video conference of a small European city network called Impacts. It's only about public transport, urban mobility and transport, and mostly capitals and big cities are members. And we had a very, very interesting exchange what is happening in cities like Madrid, Barcelona, Rome, Vienna, Berlin, and others. And I'll show you on the last slide where you can get the information about this conference. But was really amazing that all of these cities are mostly dealing with public space in very, very different way. Completely car-free streets, building up new bicycle racks on former parking spaces, temporary bus lanes, and then how they are dealing within the buses to prevent to enter too many people into the buses to keep the distance rules. Temporary broadened sidewalks and things like that. So that's really interesting, but this is actually something I can observe in every city. Just to come to a few conclusions and recommendations, also my personal view, of course, I would like to emphasize two things. First is this issue of public space, because for me, public space is the thing we'll decide if we can get in all of our cities to a more sustainable way to keep up mobility and to travel in the cities. But that has to be more than just put some color on the streets and to do some of these pop-up bike lanes or things like that. We need a more positive vision. Must be more than these rules and these temporary measures. And people should see that these measures are benefits for everyone and for the whole city, and not for example, only for the cyclists. If we have a discussion it's just for the cyclists, it won't work on the long run, I think, in the dialogue with the civil society. And again, the public space, that's actually the place where things come visible, where these benefits come visible. So to deal with it is very crucial things. And what, from my experience, the neighborhood actually is the best spatial focus for this discussion, where people are living, where I can see the benefits that these measures can have for them. Second big issue, public transport. I already mentioned it. We will need it often in the future. And we can do a lot of stuff for cycling and pedestrians, but public transport, if it breaks down, cycling and pedestrians can't keep up with that negative effects that would have. And one thing, actually, come back of one of the challenges I mentioned at the beginning, is that we should try to maintain some of these changes in attitudes and behavior on things like how flexible can we work? Can we create more flexible working and school hours, for example, to reduce the peak hours in public transport, which cause right now the biggest problems for the people to use public transport, because they don't feel safe if they are just full and stuffed. So more home office, things like that. If we can keep up these changed attitudes also in the future, I think that would help, especially public transport. And last thing, to keep up on what I said before, you all have to share experience and knowledge between the cities, which I'm actually doing right now. And if you want to learn more about the video conferences and the presentations given in this conference of this Impact Network last week, just go to this internet link and you can see all presentations and see what's done in these cities. So that's just in short an introduction from my side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Burkhard. And now I would like to ask Magdalena for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Michal, and hello once again to everybody else. I've chosen this picture, as you can see, on the first slide, not just because I like the movie Finding Nemo, but mainly because I think that it really shows what the corona crisis did to us, both physically, mentally, and perhaps even emotionally. We have been enclosed into our own safe world. And it really doesn't matter whether it was because our borders have closed or because our governments have put out restrictions, or whether it was just our own fear that we might become ill with COVID. The outcome was the same. And I think it's often up to the local authorities to aid their citizens because they're closest to them, to try to come up with solutions and alternatives. So we don't end up in a world where everybody is enclosed in their little own sane environment, like, as Berhad mentioned, for example, traveling everywhere by a car. And by that, contributing to elevated CO2 levels or air pollution and other issues. So I would like to give you a little perspective from a small town where I'm a mayor. The name is Mnišek Podbrdy. I was actually born in this town, and then came back to it about 8 years ago. As you can see, this is a small town with a lot of greenery. It's also very hilly, which is a reason why it is quite challenging to introduce, for example, cycling as a regular public transport, because it's only for the very fittest. And we are discussing options how to introduce electric bike sharing, but that's definitely for the future talks. What I would like to do at the moment is give you a very short introduction so you understand the links between different issues. Mnišek Podbrdy is roughly 30 kilometers southwest of Prague. It has 6,000 inhabitants, so it's a small town. And most of the people from the so-called economically active sort commute daily to the capital. So we have roughly 2,000 people who move every day to Prague and back for their work or perhaps school. And that was, of course, before the corona crisis. Then we had a lockdown period during which people still moved, but not as much. And then after the corona crisis, the connection to Mnišek looked like this. This is the freeway that people use. In the past, a lot of people use public transport, which in our case is bus transport. And our town pays a lot of money to make that bus transport regular and flexible and available to people. But after the corona crisis, as Burkhard already mentioned, a lot of people were scared of using the public transport and so started using their cars. And so the freeway, as you can see, looked like this at peak hours. And what we were trying to sort out is how we can aid this issue, given that it doesn't entirely lie on our borders, on the borders of our town, because we are so closely connected to Prague. So before I go to the next slide, I think it's important to say that during the lockdown stage of the corona crisis, we had information from our internet providers that the data usage on the internet have increased by 30 to 40%. And there were areas where people did not have regular and stable access to internet, and therefore they could not work very efficiently from home, despite the fact that many of them tried to do that, so they could avoid travel and potentially being infected with coronavirus. So, and I realize that this may be irrelevant for those of you who come from well-developed countries where infrastructure is something that has been already tackled in the past, but unfortunately we are not all there, and maybe some of my colleagues from the Centre and Eastern Europe may agree with me. So hopefully this is a small inspiration for those of you who tackle similar issues. So under normal circumstances in our town, we have infrastructure, whatever infrastructure it is, including the internet cables, optic cables, that are placed in the ground. That is in line with our urban planning. However, when we discussed this with my colleagues in the council, we came up with a realization that the best commute is no commute at all, and that we would like to actually try to find a solution how we could keep a lot of our people in our town and reduce that amount of commuting to Prague. And so we decided to change the rules with some restrictions and allow temporary installations of fiber optic cables on streetlights. It doesn't look very good, but it's very fast. So the process that used to take at the best months, but usually took years, because you had to have different kinds of permit, and by the time everything got prepared, it was a couple of years later, or sometimes 3 or 4. So we have managed to speed up this process, and so now it only takes a few weeks. We have had our first optic cables installed last week, and so the places which are slightly more remote, that are not in the center of the town, but they are still part of the town, now look like this. As you can see, these are the fiber optic cables that will later be replaced with the optic cables that will be put in the ground once we construct a local footpath. But we decided that there's no point making people travel to Prague if they can have work that can be done on home office, and they don't have to wait 2 years before we construct that footpath. They could actually have some sort of option to work from home thanks to this temporary installation. So for me, the take-home message is that at times like these, it's important to be innovative and occasionally change rules, even if that means that temporarily you come with solutions that seem to be aesthetically not as appealing, but are actually functional, and at the same time encourage that vision with other people, how we can aid as local authorities and contribute to their quality of life. Because what I've heard from people who have actually connected to these fiber optics last week was that because they have negotiated some new conditions to their contract, they stay at home 1 or 2 days a week. They have more time with their kids. They have time for themselves to walk around in the forest, and all of a sudden their life has reached a new balance that they didn't know before. And I think this should be part of our legacy as the Greens. So that is for me, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Magdalena. It's very nice, and I'm looking forward to what kind of innovation will Elke show us.
Okay, thank you. It was very inspiring already. Yeah, I think like in the rest of the world, we also have been touched by COVID, and I'm responsible in Brussels for mobility and the public space. And so we had to act, we had to react in this situation. It was, well, it's never easy, but it's a few challenges. I don't know if I can, okay, I can do my own presentation, I'm sorry. So in the beginning, in the COVID situation, we had a very strange Brussels. We had empty train stations, empty roads, no visitors, no tourists, no people coming, working here, people staying home. So a lot of less traffic, up to 50 to 90% less traffic. It depends on where you look, because on the main roads, you still had about half of the traffic, but in the neighborhoods where people lived, there was almost no traffic. Also public transport, nobody wanted to take it. That's one part of it, but also nobody was allowed to use it if it was not for a necessary displacement. So also there we saw that it's about 10 to 15% of the amount of people using public transport. The only thing that changed was people by foot and on bike. So in the beginning, we were not allowed to do a lot, but you could come out. So in Belgium, during the whole lockdown period, you were allowed to come out, and you were allowed to walk and to cycle, to take some air, which was very important, because in Brussels, most people live in apartments, don't have a garden. And so coming out, which is essential for your mental health and for your physical health, was coming out in a public space. And so the only thing that we saw is that, well, people coming out, starting to cycle, learning to cycle, and the confrontation that the public space where normally 70% is provided for the individual car was suddenly almost empty from cars, but more and more cyclists and pedestrians coming. In the weekends, it almost tripled the amount of cyclists. So it was very unusual for Brussels. But we realized we had to do something, because if the pedestrians come out and they need to keep 1.5 meters distance between them, and you're on a small path, it's almost not possible. So we needed to change the way the public space was shared and used and provided. So the first thing we did, and it was an inspiration that came from Vienna, the first thing we did was installing residential zones of slow streets. And the idea is that we gave the people the permission, when they're on foot, to use the whole of the street, and not only the sidewalks, but the whole of the streets, and cars had to give them an absolute priority and could drive maximum 20 kilometers an hour. And that was a way that we could install in a very fast way a much more place for pedestrians and also for cyclists. Of course, this was a good thing. For the moment, we have about 100 kilometers of those slow streets. The largest part of it is in the historical center of Brussels. The historical central, which is an area of almost 5 square kilometers, is all in this slow street system. So everybody has to keep the speed limit of 20 kilometers an hour, and pedestrians are allowed to be on the whole of the street. A lot of them are in very densely populated zones, which is really important, because there we notice the most of the problems. It's not only next to a fancy park or anything, it's really there where people live together that we needed to create the most public space. We also closed some cars because we have roads going through parks, so those were also closed in order to make the parks larger during this crisis. So that was the first stage that we were in, was creating a place, a city where people could come out in all safety with keeping social distance between them. Then we had Berlin inspiring us, because many international cities inspiring us, saying, well, look at Berlin, they're putting temporary bike lanes in place. It's okay, that might be interesting, because in Brussels, we know we have a problem in bicycle lanes. People who want to drive a bike always say, okay, we're afraid we'll get hurt. So offering safe infrastructure is the most important argument to convince somebody to use their bike. So we said, okay, if Berlin can do it, we can do it as well. Let's put in place some temporary bike lanes and make some a network. So the whole idea was to make a network of bicycle paths, so that once you're on it, you can continue in safe connection. So we're focusing on the missing links, because we do have some bicycle lanes. We're not starting from an empty page, but making sure that the missing links between bicycle paths were connected, and in that way create really a safe space for cyclists all over the city. It's not by coincidence how we use it. We have a long-term plan for mobility. So we have a plan for 10 years for mobility in Brussels. It's called Good Move. It's just approved 2 months before the corona crisis. And in that mobility plan, we have a view for 10 years for a city, how we want to change our city. And the bicycle lanes we're putting in place were also the ones that were on a high priority in this long-term plan. The same, if we go back to our the slow streets, it's creating neighborhoods where people feel at least can come out. It is a measurement that is connected to the long-term plan we have for Brussels, because what we did for our mobility plan is we created 50 zones, 50 neighborhoods in Brussels. We identified them, and we want to, by 5 neighborhoods per year, we want to change them and make sure that the traffic cannot cross. You can enter, but you cannot drive through. Make sure that you have a circulation plan, do some rearrangements in order that cyclists and pedestrians are at ease in the neighborhood. So that was already the long-term plan that helped us to do the temporary measurements. Same for the bicycle lanes, and actually the same for the third measurements we took, and that is park and ride parking. So making sure that those people coming to Brussels by car leave their car at the entrance of Brussels and continue by public transport or by bike. So that's a third measurement that we took. Is making sure that we offer that, because we noticed that people are a bit afraid to take the train as well. And so there were more, especially people when the economy was restarting, more and more people are using their car to come to Brussels, and we are already completely congested, so we cannot take more cars. So we really need to convince people to either use public transport or go by bike or go by foot. Normally, the park and ride system is to make an interchange to the public transport, but we now installed everywhere also shared bicycle system. So we have this system of shared bikes. It's the yellow bikes that you can use in Brussels. We made them for free. For during 6 months, people can use those bikes for free. They're electric, they're hybrid. You can use it electric or non-electric. You can use it in both ways. It's a huge success. We already have 7,000 people registering in the system, so we don't have enough batteries anymore. So we needed to, now it's only free for, well, it's still free, but we cannot hand out any batteries anymore. So it's a huge success. And we see that the bicycle is really becoming very popular for the moment in Brussels. So that was the third aspect we had. We have some pop-up parking systems. So in the north of Brussels, we didn't have a parking space. So we contacted some owners of big areas where normally there were events, and now still there's no events allowed. We said, okay, can you use your parking that is usually used for events now for this park and ride bike? So we have these temporary parkings as well next to the existing ones that we already had. We also made them for free to really give the signal for the moment. You do not have an excuse not to use them. It's for free. You can use a free bike and you can continue on 40-kilometer extra bicycle lane in the city. So please do so. It's important to give that message because, as I said, public transport is not as popular as before the crisis. People are afraid. It is clean, so we keep on saying to people, if you need it, it is safe. There is a lot of cleaning and disinfection, but you need to avoid peak hours and full buses, and you need to avoid that in this crisis, you cannot allow full trams or full buses. So we do urge people who are in good health, who go for small distances, to go by foot or to go by bike if they can. And in Brussels, about 2/3 of the displacements within the region are for distance smaller than 5 kilometers. So we know we can improve on bicycle use and on walking in that, if we offer the good conditions for that. So that's the Corona situation. Perhaps the last measurement I would like to share with you is preparing for the summer. We hope that summer is there. We're allowed to organize, we're not allowed to organize mass events, but we are allowed to meet in small groups, and that's good news because that will make it possible that we can go out and meet our neighbors and restart a bit of our social life. And we know that this summer we won't be traveling as much. It's even if it's allowed, lots of people don't have the money because they lost their jobs or lost their income. So we know that a lot of the people who live in Brussels will stay in Brussels and not go on a holiday. So we need to prepare the city for it. So we made now a call for the citizens, and if they want to create a small area in their neighborhood, they can ask for some funding to put on some infrastructure, for example, a little playground, a little terrace, a little more a green area. And the idea is really to keep it very bottom up. So there's different calls for action. So the HoReCa sector, the hotels and the restaurants and the cafes, they can apply to have extra space for their terraces. Citizens can organize themselves and apply for a little playground if they have a proposition. So you have all these little pop-up things, and we hope in that way, instead of having a few mass events, having a mass of a few events in our city this summer, so that we can enjoy the summertime with all the measurements for the crisis. So I think that's it for Brussels. These are in mainline, I mean, the big parts of the policy measures that I've been taking within my competences. It is public transport and public space. Of course, there's a lot of other things done also by Greens in the government. But since the topic for today was this, I will stop here and be open for questions.
Okay, thank you for all your presentations. With the time remaining, I will try to keep my questions very short, and basically I have two of them. And we have seen what has been done and what are the nice things we can see in all the places. But I would like to ask all of you if there has been any kind of opposition or backlash from the people, because from our experience in Prague, they have closed like 200 meters of one street for like the pedestrians, and there has been a huge backlash of the drivers that it's like completely messing up the traffic in the Prague. So I would like to know how was the reaction of the people, both like positive, but I'm really interested in the negative reaction, both in Brussels, Berlin, and maybe in Munich.
Shall I answer?
Yeah,
it's well, it's if you announce that you're putting extra bicycle lanes, most of the people are happy because they want a bicycle lane. But the moment you put it in place, you have to put it somewhere. You need a physical place to do so. So you either take away parking spaces or a car lane. These are the two options. You cannot take away housing or the area for pedestrians. So the moment you put it in place, you do have a lot of protest. And we at a certain moment we tackled the Rue de la Loi, which is the street before the European institutions. It's very symbolic. You had 4 car lanes and a small area for pedestrians and bikes that was shared. And so we took away a bike lane, put a car lane to put some bicycle lane there, and there was a huge protest against it. So every time you put it in place, there's protest. The protest is quite similar every time. It's like we will have more traffic jams because of your measurements. And on the one hand, it's true, of course. We notice that on some places, if you take away place for the cars, they do have impact on the car, on the speed that the cars can drive to the city. But on the other hand, if you do not offer alternatives, more people will be in the car, and the longer the traffic jams will be. So you need to continue explaining that if we don't do that, if we don't offer safe bicycle infrastructure, the people that are now on the bike will be in the car before behind them, and that's even worse. So we try to explain that the cyclist is the best ally of a car driver, because it's not before or behind you in the traffic jam. It will not take your parking space, so it's your best friend actually. But it is a difficult situation, and it takes a lot of time to continue explaining and making sure that it's accepted. What we did do is, in the beginning of the confinement, we changed all the traffic lights that we could to have a longer time of green for pedestrians and cyclists. And what we're doing now is, there where we've put in a bicycle lane in place, we are again giving green for a longer time for the cars, so that in the beginning it might be a bit of traffic jam, but then after a few days we can adapt the lights and make it more fluent. So it is a bit, well, searching for the best solution, but it's not without any contestation. But,
okay, and how it was in Berlin, Burkhard?
Well, in Berlin, at first there was actually no opposition at all. Everybody thought, good idea. We have to have the possibility. There's almost no car traffic in the street, so it's not a problem for anyone. And now, as car traffic is increasing again, the discussion also changes a little bit. Still, I think there's quite a big majority, at least right now, in favor of these measures. But there are some specific measures that I already mentioned, that haven't planned that carefully as they should have been. For example, in Kantstraße, in the western part of the inner city, where some very important bus routes are using the street, whereas there's no metro or a light rail service in parallel, and one lane was taken away for the bike lane, and then only one lane was left for private cars and the buses, and that some of the bus stops couldn't be reached safely for the bus, and there also was some problems with deliveries. Still, I think it's still, you have to be quick with these measures. That's perfectly all right, but still you have to of course, to take care and take into account some crucial issues that this actually can work. And I think Berlin actually is a city with very, very lots of still broad streets. So in Berlin, it's quite easy to do that. If you have 3 lines in one direction, it's really not a big problem to take one away. Even or in other German cities like Cologne or Munich, Hamburg, this is much more difficult. Although they also have some bigger streets, but they also have more car traffic than Berlin has. I think it's what Elke said. You have to explain and to continue explaining. You have to explain what's the benefit for all, not only for the cyclists but for all. And you should also, of course, try to make it not look as a temporary provisional solution all the time. You have to work to make it look as aesthetically much more better than it does today. It shouldn't be only a temporary solution for years. You have to work to make public space look nice and to rebuild the streets in a way that all the people living there are having a benefit of it, not only the cyclists on these lanes.
I have a small comment on the communications, and I totally support what Burkhard and Elke have said, that even in a small town like ours, it's absolutely crucial that you keep explaining to people what's happening. And there's like a small anecdote where when the workers were hanging those fiber optic cables on the street lights, they had to close for about 10 minutes the whole road because they needed to get to it. And during those 10 minutes, there's a couple of cars and drivers who were absolutely beside themselves with anger that they had to wait. And I think that just kind of shows the mentality and how when you are in a position of decision maker, you have to be very patient and just keep repeating the same thing over and over, even when you feel like you have already said it in all the newspapers and all your channels and all your media 10 times, 20 times, 100 times. You still have to do it 105th time because it is important so everyone understands.
Okay, and then my second question goes to the public transport. We have mentioned it several times, and what do you think are the solutions to keep or get people back to the public transport? Is more like, let's say, explaining how it's necessary, or like the more, let's say, disinfection and like all these like hygienic measures, or is like the price way, so we will make the public transport even more affordable? What are your solutions to like the buses, trains, and trams? Who would like to start, Burkhard?
I don't have the solution. It is really difficult. I think, of course, things to do all these hygienic measures, you have to do them anyway. That's of course important, but that I think won't be the point. The point is how that people have got a little bit used to this distancing thing, and they have learned that, or they've heard that it's supposed to be dangerous to use public transport if you can't keep the distance. And I think in the first things you have to try to make the capacities larger, which you can do, for example, by trying to reduce actually something like flatten the curve, the peak hours. By these measures we already talked about, more flexible starting hours for work in schools, and to do more video conferences, to do more home office. And then you at least you have less problems with the peak hours, and then you of course you already have much more capacity in the peak hours. But that won't probably also be not the only solution. And because if actually we want to have to use people, to have more people use public transport than actually before the Corona crisis, if we want to change things in our cities. So we have to improve public transport in general. That means more cars and trains and more dense timetable, and therefore we need the resources and the money and the budget. And that's the next big problem, because of the strong decrease of people using public transport, a lot of the revenue for the companies have broken down, and so actually we need a strong political commitment for public transport, and to tell people although we'll have an economic crisis in our cities that is coming up, we can't ignore it. Public transport we still see as the backbone of our transport system in the cities, and we will bring up the money we need to maintain it in a big way, and actually to make it better and to make it as safe as possible. It's a lot of communications, it's about infrastructure, it's about the measures I mentioned, which are dealing more about how people are moving around in the city and at what times they are moving around in the city. And of course, cycling also have public transport. If you create capacity also by taking away space from cars that people use the bicycles, then you also have on the whole advantages for public transport because they can use the capacities for the people who still need public transport.
Okay, are there any other ideas from both of you, ladies?
I've got a short one. What happens in our region, because I come from a region of very small towns or villages that are closely connected by public transport, and they mostly all head towards Prague, is that some of our providers have gone on a verge of total collapse in terms of finance, which is what Burkhard mentioned, that because the money has gone out of public transport, some of these providers are not able to keep all their equipment and especially all their drivers. And so I think it is a political decision to make sure that if the either local or regional or state money goes into something, it has to go into saving companies that provide public transport. We have already been approached as a town to participate, and we're trying to find ways how to do it, despite the fact that we as a local authorities have lost funding as well because of the coronavirus. But I think it is something that needs to be a priority, because if we lose some of these providers, then we will lose the service. We will go into that negative spin of people going back to cars, and then it will be much harder to recover afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We know we have a huge cost coming up in financing the loss of income for our public transport. It is all in public hands in Brussels and in Belgium. It's on different levels of politics that it's important, but I think there we have something that is at least in Brussels, that we know we'll have to do that. And I don't think that will be the question. The question is, how will we finance it in the coming years? Because we had a lot of infrastructure plans, having more buses, having more tram lines, having an extra metro line. And the question is, will we find the funding to continue to do so? Because we have a lot of income as a region, because people are becoming more poor after this crisis. On the other hand, we have more costs, we have fewer people using public transport, so it will be a difficult debate, and the impact on our budget will be very, very difficult. But we need to keep it. Everybody's convinced that without public transport, you lose the future of your city. You cannot lose that, but it's important to teach people how to use it. For the moment in Belgium, wearing a mask on public transport is it's obliged. People do respect it mostly, so it is quite well respected. Making sure that you wash your hands and explaining to people that it is safe. But then, as Burkhard said, spreading the peak hours. In Belgium, we have a very concentrated peak hours. In most cities, it is about 6 hours a day that you have peak hours. In Belgium, it's all on 4.5 hours. We all want to go from 9 to 5 and really strict 9 to 5. So changing the mentality and saying, okay, it's okay if you come just for the afternoon to work and work from home in the morning, or start a bit later, start a bit earlier. So that's something that will have a huge impact. We will need to work on, and then we will need to make public transport more attractive. It's too soon, but once we've beaten Corona, and I hope it will be soon, we will need to make some campaigns for our public transport and attracting people again to use it. But it's a bit too soon for the moment. What we did was keeping a full capacity. So even if we only have 10% of people using it, we kept on providing the full capacity of the most as possible, because a lot of the drivers are ill as well, but a full capacity for where it's possible, to make sure that the buses that are driving are not fully packed. And so that is also a political choice, a financial choice, of course. And that's something that we will continue to do, because the more buses you have, the fewer people are on it.
Yeah, thank you. There's a nice question from the audience by Enrico Ottolini. During the crisis, we have seen the huge surge of using the deliveries and the e-commerce for like doing the shopping, and it makes much more like delivery cars going around our cities. Have you noticed there is some kind of problem in your city, or do you think there is a way how to manage this? Who would like to react on this?
I lost connection for a moment, so I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
Well, in Berlin, it has been a problem anyway also before Corona, when COVID-19 crisis, that deliveries have gone up because of e-commerce and other things. So it's actually not a new problem, and Berlin has set up a strategy for urban logistics, and is trying to deal with it as good as possible to do more consolidated deliveries, so for example, we have one so-called micro hub where several companies like UPS, DPD, DHL, and others are using one hub together to change from normal lorries to bicycles, to do the delivery for the last mile in a special quarter in Berlin. That's just a pilot project going on. I think to manage it, that would be a completely separate discussion, which would need another hour. I think there are strategies, and not everything can be done by bike, but I think Berlin has quite a good strategy, and I think you find on the website of the Senate some ideas how to deal with it. It might be in other cities which aren't as big as Berlin. The problem might be more obvious now during Corona crisis than in these large metropolitan cities areas.
Just a short comment from me. I must say that under circumstances where you are an end town at the end of a long line, so that example that I've used of my town with respect to Prague, where most of the goods come from, we have evaluated that it is actually much more ecological for one courier to come and drive around the town with delivery than if all those people drove to Prague and back. So we recognize that in these circumstances, the e-commerce is actually still a little bit better than when everyone's commuting. So the issue that I see is more in regulating what Burkhard mentioned. So the sizes of the vehicles that are used, sometimes the training of the drivers, because what we often encounter is that they drive 80 k's an hour in a 30k zone, and that's not okay. But these are more local, small individual issues.
What we do notice, it's there's a huge boom of the e-commerce, of course, people having all these packages delivered at their house, and that has an impact on traffic and on road security as well, because they often park on bicycle lanes or on the sidewalk. So that's a big thing. On the short term, we are encouraging, so we gave some extra subsidies for bike couriers, making sure that we can promote delivery by cargo bikes. There's a long way to go, because we think that about 20 or 30% of the cargo or those things can be replaced by bike cargo. So we really need to put that in place. We're waiting for a European project. We are hoping to have some funding for a large-scale project on that, but news will come before summer. Also creating, but I think that's the same as everywhere, creating hubs so people can come there, and then there's a hub to change, and also changing in policy, because now people are expecting to be home delivered and which is during this lockdown perhaps logic, but when we all will be starting working again and going out, it's far more logic to have a delivery at a local shop. It's good for the local shop because people come there and they might buy something. It's better because you can have a series of packages and you avoid too much traffic. So we want to change it. About 80% for the moment is home delivery and 20% in local shops. We want to shift those numbers and make sure that 80% is in the local shop or in a collecting point in a neighborhood, and 20% in really the home delivery. We have some plans for that in our mobility plan, but it's a huge work.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And there's a time for last question. it's in the chat that what do you think that does the city management should change in order to address the new challenges, or is like the way how it works was like okay for such a, let's say, unexpected crisis? Because you have, all of you have been into quite a lot of like improvisation, but on the other side, if we can have some kind of conclusions that things should be changed forever, also not in the terms of putting the bike lanes, but in the way how we deal with the city management. Like Magdalena would like to start.
Yeah, I hope I understood the question right, because I can't see it in the chat. But whether I think that local authorities should change something for good, I think absolutely. One of the things that we are doing in our council is actually not just updating our crisis plan, but also what is more like a long-term community plan, which involves or strategically important areas. And now I'm talking, apart from traffic, I'm talking energy, waste, water, everything that, if you imagine another crisis, which would mean a lockdown, what resources does any kind of town need, and how are we going to be prepared for that kind of situation? And there's no straight answer to that, as everyone knows. It's really a careful strategic planning, and we could be here for hours later talking about it. But I think what the crisis has really showed us is that we need to have those plan Bs. We need to be prepared for situations where things don't work as they used to, and we can't be surprised anymore. Like, I think we have worked well now because we know how to improvise, but the second time there's no such excuse. We'll basically have to have that plan, and we need to start working on it now.
Okay, Burkhard, your reaction?
Yes. Well, I think we need more resilient structures, and that's what we just, I think, all have learned during the last month. Of course, urban transport planning has to be an integrated part in urban development planning, and yes, land use planning in general. And I think lots of things we can learn, and also some discussions we're just having. Some people say density is dangerous. That COVID-19 has shown that, but that's completely wrong. If you look at the numbers in Germany, cities like Berlin have less infections than some rural areas. So it hasn't to do with density in the cities. We still, I think, need this city of short distances where people can walk and cycle to go to work, and have their shops and small structures in the neighborhoods, which I mentioned in the beginning. In my where I live, in the part of the city, quite in the inner part of the city, lots of people have lived there but never really walked around and seen what qualities they have in their neighborhood where they're living. And if we can maintain this, that these small structures can be strengthened, that is, for my opinion, one part of more resilient city structure. And we have, and concerning the financial crisis that's coming up, I think we have to prioritize much more carefully what is really resilient and on the long term good for the city, and not only put the money in 2 or 3 big infrastructure projects, but to put it in these structures and in smaller kind of infrastructure, and which can also work when we have a crisis. We don't know how it looks like the next one.
Okay, thank you. And okay.
I can relate to the answer given before, but I think what for us is really lesson I learned, and especially from mobility and the use of public space, that we really urgently need to redistribute public space, making sure that people walking and cycling have much more place, children playing, people meeting each other, and that place we're giving to cars really needs to be reduced, and it will be a long way. The good thing is that we do have a plan, and I'm even more than ever convinced that the mobility we have for the long term, the 10-year plan, is a good plan. So we need to put it in place because it will make a difference. And also the what Bernard said from the distance. So making Brussels a city where you're at 10-minute distance from everything that you need is really important. This idea is something that we all also inscribe, making sure that you have everything in your neighborhood and making sure that you create a neighborhood apt to that. So of course, I hope we won't have a second crisis, but if we do have one, I think Magdalena is right. We need to have a plan. We need to prepare the plan now, because it's good one time to experiment, but it was a lot of chaos, and we need to avoid that for the future time.
Okay, thank you. So our time is up. For the conclusion, I would like to say that from my perspective, this crisis brought a lot of green priorities into the front pages, because we have already focused on using public space more greener way to put more space for the sustainable mobility, and now it is happening, at least in some part of Europe, I have to say. So we would like to work on it in the European Greens. Also, as was briefly mentioned, we would like to focus that during the activities of the European Union, during the recovery plan, we would like to secure that the good part of the money goes to the sustainable mobility or to the cities itself, so they can manage to make this measures permanent. And we will also try to address all this topic of resilient cities in our other activities and plans on the level of European Greens, so we can share all these experiences and discuss other how to make our cities better and more sustainable. So I would like to thank you, Elke van der Brand for the Brussels, Burkhard Horst from the Berlin, and Magdalena Davis from Nišek Podbrdy, and I would like to wish you the nice European Council and the rest of the program. So see you next time, maybe not only in the virtual environment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.